appreciate kuti panangu pilipo pinatani panangu pinadzachinja kusogoloko.
As mulheres precisam de ser empoderadas, autônomas. Isso vai mudar tudo.
Wanted me to talk just a little bit about what we've been doing in Gorongosa National Park. We're in central Mozambique, most of you probably know. We're surrounded by 200,000 people in 16 communities in a greater ecosystem that includes the park and includes a sustainable development zone around the park. We like to think of ourselves as a human rights park. It means that Gorongosa sees its mission as more than just protecting wildlife and biodiversity, which we clearly do, but it sees our mission as helping the people who share the ecosystem. Indeed, it's their ecosystem. We work hand in hand with the government of Mozambique on health care. We provide health care to more than 100,000 people per year. We work in 50 primary schools with girls and boys, and we help them in after-school clubs, and we help them with their reading and with other things. We help small farmers. Well, those 200,000 people are on our side. That's why poaching has gone down. We haven't lost an elephant in 2 years. We haven't lost a lion in 2 years. Almost all poaching is down to nearly zero, and that's why the wildlife is flourishing. But the relationship is even deeper than that. We had a cyclone this past year, Cyclone Idai. Many of you heard about it. At the time, it was called the largest weather disaster in the history of the Southern Hemisphere. It hit right next to Gorongosa Park. Well, our rangers were the first responders in that cyclone. Then we started feeding people. We were feeding as many as 50,000 people for 5 or 6 months. Well, we won a lot of friends doing that with the local people. It changes the relationship when we realize we're all on the same side. We see it as one big picture. When the people who live next to Gorongosa Park are getting a livelihood in sustainable jobs that are using the natural resources. We grow cashew trees, we make honey, we grow coffee among the rainforest trees, ecotourism, forestry, all kinds of employment inside the park. We're creating a green economy in a greater landscape in which the park is the center, and then you move out to buffering areas. And when you see it all in one big whole like that, then you realize human development and the conservation of nature are not two different things. They're interwoven at Gorongosa National Park. I wasn't trained in conservation, I was trained in human rights. So let's say I only had one thing on my mind, and that was girls in school and rights for women. In Gorongosa, we have a goal. 50% of our employees will be women. We've already achieved that in some of our departments. More than half of our scientists are women. You've maybe heard about some of them. Dominique Gonçalves is our manager of elephant ecology. Paula Booley is our associate director for all conservation. So another piece, though, to diversity that I want to talk about. Yeah, we want diversity in women and men, of course. But what about diversity across different cultures? What about local, wise, traditional people working side by side with Western-trained ecologists? Our park warden, Pedro Magura, was born right near Gorongosa Park, speaks several local languages. He is of this culture. Well, when we reintroduced wild dogs to Gorongosa National Park, he told me that the wild dog was his clan animal, and he hadn't seen a wild dog in Gorongosa in 30 years. In Pedro's words, it restored his soul. But he went on to explain more to me about what it means to have a clan animal. A lot of people have a clan animal that is, for instance, a lion. Well, if your clan animal is the lion, you don't go out and set snares and gin traps in this ecosystem because a lion might step in one. And Pedro told me that when families are reconnected to their spiritual traditions and see their clan animals, poaching goes down. And it's not just that. Let's just talk about the forest. Pedro Magura explained to me that there's hundreds of local plants that traditional medicine can use. Pedro's exact words to me were, if the forest is your pharmacy, you will protect it. You're not going to want to see it cut down. You're not going to want to see it burned down. So when local people are connected to their spiritual traditions that are part of nature, of course they help us protect nature. We don't for 1 second at Gorongosa National Park think that we do everything right. Of course not. Conservation, human development, these are challenging. It takes pragmatists, not ideologues. We try things, they don't always work. We call that a lesson, not a mistake. Then we adjust, then we try something else. We listen to each other. But most of all, I want to end on a note of optimism. Gorongosa isn't the only success story. Many of you sitting in the audience are in the room today because you're coming from a success story and you were invited to this meeting for your knowledge, your success, your ideas. We could do this. We can rewild critical parts of this earth on every continent. Nature knows how to heal itself when we let it. And the good news is that the healthiest thing of all for a human being is to be outdoors in an intact wilderness. Thank you. Colleen wanted me to talk just a little bit about what we've been doing in Gorongosa National Park. We're in central Mozambique, most of you probably know. We're surrounded by 200,000 people in 16 communities in a greater ecosystem that includes the park and includes a sustainable development zone around the park. We like to think of ourselves as a human rights park. It means that Gorongosa sees its mission as more than just protecting wildlife and biodiversity, which we clearly do, but it sees our mission as helping the people who share the ecosystem. Indeed, it's their ecosystem. We work hand in hand with the government of Mozambique on health care. We provide health care to more than 100,000 people per
If everyone
year.
could start
We run
moving
50
into the
primary
Gildenhorn
schools
conference
with
room,
girls
please.
and
The event's
boys,
about
and
to
we help
start.
them in after-school clubs, and we help them with their reading and with other things. We help small farmers. Well, those 200,000 people are on our side. That's why poaching has gone down. We haven't lost an elephant in 2 years. We haven't lost a lion in 2 years. Almost all poaching is down to nearly zero, and that's why the wildlife is flourishing. But the relationship is even deeper than that. We had a cyclone this past year, Cyclone Idai. Many of you heard about it. It was, at the time, it was called the largest weather disaster in the history of the Southern Hemisphere. It hit right next to Gorongosa Park.
Okay.
Well, our rangers were the first responders in that cyclone. Then we started feeding people. We were feeding as many as 50,000 people for
If
5 or
everyone
6
could take your
months.
seat, please. The event
We
is
won a
about
lot
to
of friends
start.
doing that with the local people. It changes the relationship when we realize we're all on the same side. We see it as one big picture.
Where are we at in this video?
When the people who live next to
We'll do the
Gorongosa
last video,
Park
actually.
are getting a lot.
Yep, we'll go to the last video.
Okay. Do this actually, and then this should start it, right? All right, so this is the McCormick video. Okay. Hi, Alyssa. Do you need anything? You're good. Okay. So after this video,
Le
we'll
ulun le
start.
pambul taloha, ulun tukna zen vangan vanilla. De zerim vanga
Hey,
vanilla,
John.
chaz
Thank you
vol.
for coming. Thank
Taratas fo
you.
amin de chaz vol.
So,
De
Peggy,
sair ngan
this
babuk.
video is just
Ulanga tam naz halat. Taftunga tam zen manuk tam de mars zarif mangal tilhem pangalat. Labani mzeni balatint matu. Amni labani timatu yu.
yeah.
Mun maharat bidin labani
Well, I don't have a
saba.
mic, so that's a good
De haf
question.
tiuze, un forn hip, anangan le cooperative le vol le
This is the last video.
Ankat kuzemo mo fivrienga, de nandal zen le pamas vola, en sibia kliza. De avetan zare na nyeki, na rentang, ar nangap zahei, amni stovang, nangap ar teknik.
Tumchen hit zahem namenga ftobna namenga zahe hindes miyar labani.
Your job.
Sena zen, nin kambang zen ni, misi ang bunang pangan kil, rahwala kambang. Kambang na to ang bunang kil ni.
Beyond having a stable, steady market that will buy his product, there's a whole host of other benefits for the farmers delivered to him, not only during the harvesting season, but throughout the year. That allows farmers, once they are short in cash, especially during the lean period, to take small loans that's interest-free to help cover their basic needs, up until the point where they'll be able to sell vanilla, get the revenue to repay the loans.
This video is almost
Pensant
done.
que les coopératives vont grandir assez rapidement, les objectifs vont aussi augmenter au double
And
même
while,
au triple en une année. La coopérative peut s'agrandir très rapidement et pourra nous fournir beaucoup plus de production.
Our partnership with NCD Inclusive as an NGO is very, very important as we go forward. They have the experience, and by building on their past experience, we really drive our future so that we can impact the world in a more positive way.
And I want to read it and watch it at some point. You'll have to send us the link.
oh yeah, for sure. All right. Yeah, it's ready to go. We're starting now.
Good afternoon, everyone. If everyone could take their seats. I'm delighted to welcome you here today. My name is Peggy Clark. I am a vice president at the Institute and head of Aspen Global Innovators Group. When a particular innovative office of USAID calls and asks us to partner with them, we almost always say yes. So thank you to all of you for being here. And let me just say welcome to those who are on the live stream. We have the live stream going all over the world. If anyone wants to tweet out for people to connect to the live stream, I wonder if we can put that up on the screen or tell people how to connect to the live stream. So welcome everyone there. For those who arrived late, there's coffee and water across the way there by the windows if you need anything. I am delighted to welcome you to this event, Public-Private Partnerships for People in the Planet, and to launch this exciting new initiative, HEARTH, Health, Ecosystems, and Agriculture for Resilient, Thriving Societies. So we all know there's a lot of acronyms at USAID, but I think we would admit this is a pretty good one. This is a very good job, those of you. And I also just simply want to say, this is kind of historic to have people from health, environment, energy, democracy, agriculture, all of you here. Thank you very much for coming. I think we need to do this more often and let this be the first. So it's fitting that we hold this here at the Aspen Institute. At the Aspen Institute, we're all about pushing boundaries to address the critical issues of our time, especially when it means crossing disciplines and reaching across divides that are difficult to cross. So many of you may not know this, but the founding of the Aspen Institute is actually a sort of funny story. 70 years ago, right after World War II, a group of people from different disciplines came together to talk about what makes a good society. And they were scientists, they were writers, they were philosophers, they were policymakers, they were industrialists, very importantly. And they literally erected a tent on the hillside in Aspen, Colorado, which at that time was an abandoned mining town. It was not the fancy place that it is today, but they began to debate this question of how could they, across their different sectors of private and public sector and nonprofit sector, work together to create a society that was based on values, shared values in democracy and freedom and prosperity. So this is kind of an interesting thing that we're embarking on, a similar kind of adventure today. And I feel that it really is an adventure because we all know how difficult it is to break across our silos. And represented in this room, we have this deep work in global health that's very effective and promising, deep work in energy environment, deep work in democracy and in agriculture. But rarely do we think together about how we can be more effective together. And so that's the intent of HEARTH, and that's what this is about. And this is the beginning of a conversation that I hope we will all continue. So we really need to ask ourselves, how do these disciplines meet? How can we design solutions that are integrated and that are effective? And so let me just say, one way to think about this is to really start from thinking about a household in Tanzania, for example, that lives these issues in a very integrated way. So if you're a woman standing on a doorstep in Tanzania and you look up, as many of us had at Kilimanjaro, and you see the ice melt completely depleting, which I think it's still there. I don't know if it's still there. The last time I saw, it's pretty marked, the difference. She's thinking about the fact that there's less runoff from the ice melting than there was before. She wonders whether there will be enough water based on this change. She looks up at the sky. She's trying to see if rain is going to come, and she wonders when it's going to rain and when she can plant her crop, because the rainfall over the last several years has been completely erratic. The rainy season lasts longer, it starts earlier, it doesn't come, and some years there's flooding, and some years there's no rain at all, and there's drought. So then she looks down at her children, her 4 children beside her, and she thinks, if I can't get that crop in the ground, I surely can't have another child. But she likely doesn't have access to contraceptive services and is worried about whether she has enough resources to feed her children. She also thinks about the health of her children, and she recognizes that malaria is back in a different way. In areas where we previously thought we had eradicated malaria, a few percentage point increase in temperature has led to new strains of malaria bearing mosquitoes and others. So these areas are integral to her. She sees this, she experiences this as part of the household choices that she makes. And so I ask you to bring her into the room with us today and think together about how we can explore this question of integration in a very powerful way, which is what it deserves. So I'm delighted to kick us off today by introducing Jeff Haney, the Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment at USAID, E3, as he is properly called. Jeff, we're really delighted you took the time to be with us today. Jeff oversees energy and infrastructure, forest and biodiversity, land and urban, global climate offices. He was the director of the Office of Energy and ran several billion-dollar annual investments in energy portfolio. He's had 15 years of experience working in more than 18 countries, and he previously served as chief of USAID's Energy Division, among many other things. So also, Jeff, I see you went to Colgate University, which is where I went, so that's a good start. So we'll have to discuss that. But in any case, Jeff, if you could kick us off and give us the big picture, we're delighted to welcome you today.
Well, thanks so much, Peggy, and thanks to you and your entire team for hosting this event today. Public-private partnerships for people and planet. Something I had a little challenge with my girls this morning to see who could say that 10 times the fastest. Of course, I lost. I always lose in those competitions. I'm not sure why. But since USAID's founding in 1961, we have made dramatic progress across a whole host of key development sectors. And USAID recently published a policy paper where we looked at the mega-level indicators across education, poverty, health, and it's really striking over the last 50 years the progress we've made. Of course, there's one sector, unfortunately, where we see most of the mega-level trend lines moving in the opposite direction, and that's environment. And recent reports, IPCC report on land, IPCC report on oceans, the IPCC's Global Biodiversity Assessment, Lancet report on pollution, these all paint a very similar picture, and that we are not making enough progress on these key environment indicators. Each of the reports highlights some common themes. First, the developing world is disproportionately impacted and will play a huge role in finding solutions to these complex environmental challenges. And second, integration is essential, as Peggy mentioned. Sandra Diaz, one of the lead authors on the IPPIS report, stated, quote, "It is no longer enough to focus just on environmental policy. We need to build biodiversity considerations into trade and infrastructure decisions, the way that health and human rights are built into every aspect of social and economic decision-making." And I think that's a really powerful quote to challenge us all in terms of how we think of these issues globally. USAID and our partners are working to address these environmental crises, not only in the way that we work, but in who we partner with. And in 2018, the administrator launched the new private sector engagement policy, which highlights the importance of the private sector to achieving our development objectives. 9 out of 10 jobs in the developing world are created by the private sector. And USAID Administrator Mark Green probably said it best when he said, "Private enterprise is the single most powerful force for lifting lives, strengthening communities, and accelerating self-reliance." Put briefly, the policy says, anytime USAID is embarking on a new endeavor, we need to ask how we engage the private sector, both as a direct partner, as a beneficiary, and as a key stakeholder in these efforts. It's in this spirit that I am pleased to launch the new USAID partnership program, HEARTH, which is an alliance opportunity that links health, ecosystems, and agriculture for resilience and thriving societies. This opportunity elevates our private sector engagement and aims to co-create long-term sustainable solutions that are good for rural communities, good for the environment, and good for business. Despite challenges working across sector, USAID has a long history of working cross-sectoral. As I look out at all my friends in the audience, we have many people here that have been focused on this for decades. Unfortunately, I think as the megadata indicates, the status quo is simply not going to cut it anymore to achieve our collective objectives. HEARTH is a concrete example of USAID's recently announced environmental and natural resource management policy, the private sector engagement policy, and our broader efforts to work cross-sectorally. This policy, the environment and natural resource policy, serves as a guide for USAID for working cross-sectorally in 2 critical areas: strengthening natural resource management and improving urban systems. HEARTH is paving the way for a new era of partnerships where we embrace market-based approaches as a more sustainable way to support communities in achieving environmental and development outcomes at scale. Thank you so much for joining us today to further this journey. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Alyssa Lego, Deputy Office Director of the Office of Maternal and Child Health and Nutrition, a Foreign Service officer that has over 20 years of experience at USAID in the public health sector, working in missions such as Russia, Mozambique, and Haiti. Alyssa.
Thanks, Jeff. So you're dating me a little bit. I have 15 years experience, not 20, but thank you for the introduction. So I'd like to start by just echoing the word of thanks from Jeff and others to the Aspen Institute for hosting us here today. And just to reiterate the point that I think the fact that we have so many people from across the agency, not only E3, but also specifically different parts of USAID's Global Health Bureau, whom I'm representing here today, including notably CII, and we thank you for all the legwork to help us pull this off today, but also the Office for Population and Reproductive Health, and then the office I represent, which is Office of Maternal Child Health and Nutrition. As we mentioned at the beginning, Peggy said we love our acronyms, so I'll try not to incorporate those into my remarks. But I do hope that what I can bring here today is the perspective of someone who has spent the vast majority of my career outside of Washington. And so I have seen firsthand the challenges in implementing these types of integrated programming and the successes that we can have. And I'm going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about that experience today. I also want to say at the outset, and I'll come back to this in a minute, I think the rigorous monitoring and evaluation component is essential for us, because we have to be able to show that the 1 + 1 = 3. And we have to be able to show that 1 + 1 from the health perspective also improves health outcomes, because I think we all recognize that we do have congressionally appropriated funds, and it's really, really important for us to be able to articulate and to measure the improvements that are happening across different areas and objectives in these types of integrated programming. So I'll come back to that in a second. So from the global health perspective, I think folks know, but just to sort of set the scene, we have 3 macro objectives. One is around controlling HIV/AIDS, the second is around infectious disease, and the third is around preventing child and maternal deaths, and that's sort of where I sit within the Bureau. We've long known for many, many years that health is interconnected with other development sectors. I think Rob, in helping me prepare for this, really pulled some interesting data that shows that approximately half of the reductions overall in child mortality since 1990 came from outside of the health sector, such as improvements in livelihood, education, and environmental management. And so to back to your point, Jeff, we're not going to get there really on any of our objectives unless we come together, I think, in a more integrated way, because it's clear from the data just around child mortality that if 50% of the improvements are coming from outside of the health sector, we have to be thinking about this in a holistic way. So we also recognize, and I've seen many times out in the field, that catastrophic illness or injury is really one of the most likely reasons for a family to sink into poverty. And so investing in health is really critical for us to improve resilience and reduce pressures on both natural resources and the environment. So the Global Health Bureau has a long experience with population health or environment or PHE programming, which is an integrated approach to improving access to health services while helping communities to manage their natural resources and conserve ecosystems on which they depend. We've supported PHE programming in over 20 countries. And I'm just going to talk for 2 minutes about some examples that I have seen in the field, one of which I've seen firsthand. And so, because we know that demand for community health services and voluntary family planning services, for example, can increase when we combine those with conservation programming. So most specifically, in Madagascar, a marine conservation organization project integrated family planning and maternal child health into their conservation activities with USAID support. And we saw that since they added the health activities, both the health and the environmental outcomes improved significantly in the project area. The second example is one I know more intimately, and I think there was information out here that I picked up. If you do not already know the Gorongosa National Park project and investment from USAID, I would encourage you to get familiar with it. There's been a lot of press recently. Rob knows because I forward him every single one of the articles that I've seen in the last couple of weeks. But I served for 4 years in Mozambique, and so I know this project and this investment well, and I think this is a good example of the way that in which we integrated the health programming with actually the vast majority of this investment was outside of the health sector. But we looked and we really tried to strategically ensure that those communities in the areas bordering Gorongosa National Park had access to health services and had access to education and other services, because we know that if they don't, the pressure on the natural resources and the natural environment is drastically increased. And this is something that I think has really important implications for how we're thinking about USAID. But again, to go back to this piece from the Global Health Bureau, I think that's one reason why we are interested in really ensuring the rigorous monitoring and evaluation so that we can not just anecdotally offer evidence, offer examples of the type of improvements we can see in health alongside conservation, but really have the data to make sure that we support that. And so the last point that I want to touch on quickly is just around private sector engagement. I'm not going to cite sort of the official policy, which has already been mentioned, but just to offer you one example of the type of investment that we, and the type of partnership that we have in the Global Health Bureau, actually here with the Aspen Institute, the Aspen Management Partnership for Health. This is a partnership that we launched with Aspen, with Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, and other partners, along with Ministries of Health. And this is but one example of the way in which the Global Health Bureau is really trying to expand our private sector engagement beyond corporate social responsibility, because we can't stay in that lane, the CSR lane with private sector engagement. We need to get out of that lane and figure out where we can really partner to achieve shared development objectives and also tap into the private sector's core business interests. And so we look forward to using HEARTH as a platform for us to do that as we go forward. Thank you very much.
It's fine. So, and I would just add, so I'm Rob, I'm one of the members of the HEARTH team, and I would just add that the coffee you're all drinking is straight from Gorongosa National Park via Idaho, so it arrived from Mozambique this week. So thanks, Jeff and Alyssa, for your leadership. We obviously couldn't have done it without you. Just briefly, so my job is to get into the nuts and bolts of this call for proposal. So this is the data that Jeff alluded to about the many positive trends in global development that we should all celebrate. But then this is the negative trends, the extinctions that are skyrocketing in the last few decades, the increasing number of deaths from household air pollution or ambient air pollution. And then, of course, this land degradation degrades ecosystem services on which humans depend, such as air filtration and water purification. And so we're here today. This is a burning forest in Indonesia, in Borneo. This is the peat forests of Indonesia. This is obviously devastating for the local biodiversity, but it is also bad for human health, pneumonia, removes vital sources of nutrition, and it's being replaced by palm oil monoculture. And this is, of course, something that we think we can do better than. So what is HEARTH? What are we doing here? So HEARTH, as mentioned, you've heard what the acronym stands for. Specifically, it is a call to the private sector for public-private partnerships for cross-sectoral solutions for those two things: conservation of threatened landscapes alongside investments in the well-being and prosperity of the communities that depend on them. If you remember nothing else from this conversation, this is what to remember. It is a call for public-private partnerships that we want to start today, and actually we wanted to start a couple months ago, and we've had some good conversations with private sector partners already. It's also, by the way, it's Heart and Earth together. That's the other part of the acronym, because human health and planetary health are, of course, interdependent. HEARTH is centered around three big ideas. You'll notice that these are not new ideas. These are just good ideas that we want to scale up. Alyssa mentioned cross-sectoral development, something we really believe in. She also mentioned the importance of rigorous monitoring and evaluation, and then public-private partnerships. Our panelists, we'll talk more about them. One's in a cab right now. He was delayed by the weather, but he'll be here just on time because things are just working out today. And thanks for coming out in the weather, by the way. Okay, so let's talk briefly about these three big ideas, and our panelists will say more. So the first one is that cross-sectoral development can lead to better outcomes than individual silos, or as we have said, 1 + 1 = 3. I'll cite one example from the Philippines, which happens to be from one of our distinguished panelists, Heather Diagnes. They had on one island, they had a family planning program. On the second island, they had a coastal conservation program. And on the third, they had both. And then they did the rigorous measurement to show that coastal and mangrove conditions and family planning access both increased better on the third island than the first two. And if I were going to go through the rest of the evidence that has been produced by including the Forest and Biodiversity Office about the value of watersheds and forests and for human health and nutrition, we'd be here all day. And we want to get to the interesting part. We heard Ambassador Green's quote about the value of the private sector, but our fantastic environmental officer in Madagascar put it more bluntly, and she put it great. She said, we don't want the same old conservation enterprise. We want bold, transformative models at the landscape scale that reverse the deforestation that we've seen and help the community thrive. And we're glad Madagascar is one of the first 6 countries participating in HEARTH. And we heard the third point, just a brief point about the measurement. You know, there's so many sectors involved. We could overwhelm the projects with measurement. We have a plan for this, though. We have the people, resources, and some good thinking about how to make this problem manageable. So we think all HEARTH sites should be able to report on some meaningful result of these 4 high-level outcomes: biodiversity conservation, some aspect of human well-being, prosperity, and governance. And we have some funding in Washington that's going to help support this. And we will co-create with the local sites exactly the details of how we will report on this to provide for the world the additional evidence that we need to further investment towards this direction in the next decade before a lot of the environmental destruction that's happening as we speak proceeds to an unfortunate conclusion. We want to reverse that, and we're here today. We appreciate everybody being here today. So we've talked a little bit about why we want to partner with the private sector. We believe that they have unique capabilities and resources. But why should the private sector want to partner with us? We're glad to have some private sector folks in the room today. For one thing, the public sector, USAID, can help correct market failures. Sometimes the barrier to investment is just too high, or there's just insufficient information for private investment. That's where the public sector can step in and fix that. And we're proud to say that we have $50 million approximately across 6 countries ready for partnerships over the next 5 years. And we think and hope that that's actually just the start. We think it will go up. And then we will also help with the rigorous M&E. And the last thing I just want to say is we know the private sector knows that key to a successful partnership is the HEARTH team. And again, I won't be here all day talking about how great our 15-person team is, but they're a very impressive crew, and we're looking forward to partnering to advance this shared objective that obviously we all care about. So let's get to some specifics. So where is HEARTH starting? It's starting in these 6 countries. You can review the solicitation on grants.gov for details. But just to put it at a high level, what do these have in common? For one thing, they all seem to hug the Indian Ocean. But for another thing, the USAID missions in each of these countries have identified specific landscapes that are really ready for private sector investment and cross-sectoral investment. And I'll just give you one example. In Zambia, the Kafua Flats are a large ecosystem in the middle of the country through which the Kafua River passes. Zambia, by the way, has the largest proposed investment in HEARTH. And the water is crucial to everyone in the country: the animals, the people, industry, agriculture, and it's a renewable but still finite resource. And so what would a public-private partnership in the Kafua Flats look like? It might be private investment in sustainable agriculture and greening up value chains alongside USAID investment in community health, education, biodiversity conservation, and tourism, et cetera. By the way, that picture is from Gorongosa, the coffee. They're picking the coffee beans that you drank. So that's one Hearth vision. These are a few others. This is only meant to be illustrative. We know the private sector often has brilliant ideas that we haven't thought of, and we're excited to hear them, and we're inviting to hear them today. And actually, that probably gets to, yeah, so I'm almost done here because I want to turn it over to our distinguished panel. So let's get to some specifics of this call for proposal, because a lot of you are probably interested in how we might actually make this partnership happen, how we might tap into that $50 million. So this is happening under the umbrella of the GDA. Many of you may be familiar with the Global Development Alliance, the rules of which are that the USAID resources, the $50 million, is leveraged at least 1-to-1. We can have extensive co-creation discussions with private sector partners who might co-invest with us at any time, starting last week. And we invite those conversations, your ideas, where you might partner with us across those 6 countries. And I would actually add, if you know of other ideas, either in the same countries, in a different landscape, or in a different country where USAID has investments, we welcome those ideas because sometimes a great idea has a way of helping a mission become ready. And we also think that additional missions will come online in the next few months. So please monitor the solicitation on grants.gov. We're excited. We can't say exactly which ones they'll be, but we think that there will be more than these 6, and we're very excited. So after we have initial co-creation discussions with the private sector partner, then an important next step in the process is to submit to us a 5-page concept paper. There's a template at the solicitation describing at a high level what the partnership might look like. The mission and the private sector partner can have additional conversations about what this will look like, and then we can proceed to a co-creation workshop. Often this 5-page concept paper is written in partnership with NGOs, many of them represented in the room, and so we're sort of all working together to leverage our different strategic assets to try to achieve 1 + 1 = 3, because not just across sectors, but also across actors, private sector, public sector, et cetera. The deadline is about March of 2020. Again, individual countries have different deadlines, and that's designed to be long enough for all of these co-creation discussions to happen. With that, I will stop talking. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists, our leadership, without which we couldn't have done this. The Hearth team, like I said, we know how much work it took to get here. I'd like to thank Aspen and CII, including their director, Amy Lynn, who couldn't be here today, but who many of you know. And with that, you can contact us at hearthgda@usa.gov. You can send us an email right now. We will respond. And here's Hearth's 3 big ideas one last time. And with that, over to Peggy.
Thank you so much, Rob. I think I'd like to invite the panelists to come up and join me on the stage. We'll putting these bright yellow orange chairs. Also to say those that are watching live stream, we will be monitoring your questions, and so we're going to talk for about a half an hour. Feel free, I feel like I'm speaking to the air. I'm not sure where they are, but I know you see us. So please feel free to send your questions in. Heather, Judy? No. Yeah, I'll sit on the end here. Just take care. Heather, why don't you sit? Yeah. There you go, Judy. What's it? Great. Excellent. Wonderful. So let's get down to business. What might this look like? And thank you very much, Rob, for that fantastic presentation, and for all of you for your thoughtfulness around this project. So let me introduce the panelists here, all of whom have been involved in this kind of integrated work. And we're going to ask them to speak to some specific examples of how it's happened. We have our last panelist, Michael, joining us from McCormick, so he'll come in and make a big dramatic entrance, and we'll ask him a really hard question or something like that. But let me first introduce my panelists. On my far left is Heather Diagnos. Many of you know Heather from her many years at USAID. She's a program officer at the Walton Foundation now, where she runs the Environmental Programs Oceans Initiative. And she's working in Chile, Mexico, Peru, Indonesia, and the United States, particularly in fishing sustainability in the fishing industry. She's overseeing Indonesia program in particular, where there's some really exciting things happening. Heather was an Environment Foreign Service Officer with USAID, most recently living and working in Indonesia. But for many years, Heather was involved in the Family Planning, Health, and Environmental Conservation, PHE, where we've met before. So welcome, Heather. Thank you for being with us. And next we have Judy Oglethorpe. Judy is the Senior Director of Innovative Conservation Approaches at World Wildlife Fund. She was previously Chief of Party on the USAID-funded Major Green Forest Program in Nepal, where she worked for 5 years on building a project that had to do with climate resilience as well as adaptation. So she has had a lot of direct experience at this kind of work, so we're really grateful that you're here. Judy has also had 14 years experience in East and Southern Africa in wildlife, forest, and biodiversity planning and management. And Michael is not yet with us, but he'll be here in a minute. And then we have Olaf with us. Olaf Zierbach. Thank you, Olaf, for joining us. Olaf is the Senior Advisor in the Office of Forestry and Biodiversity in the E3 Bureau. He's advisor in that section. He supports the design, management, and evaluation of biodiversity, conservation, forestry, and climate change projects. And he has been working deeply on the integration of biodiversity conservation and human well-being outcomes. He served as an advisor for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation and Conservation International, leading their climate change initiative. So we have some interesting, what would the word be that? Renaissance people who have crossed over this boundary between work on environment and livelihoods and biodiversity. So let's just jump into to our questions, and when Michael joins, we can have him join us. But let me just start, and Heather, can I start with you? Tell me what, from the perspective of the Walton Foundation, which for the purposes of this grant is also defined as a private sector entity, what's your unique perspective that you would bring to an effort like this? And then also if you could tell us a little bit about the Nepal work, which led you to be so committed to this approach.
Sure. So I think from the perspective of a foundation, a private foundation like the Walton Family Foundation, what we're so interested in the integrated work is that we often have a narrow focus on one sector like environmental conservation. In our case, it's fisheries sustainability. But yet when you're working in that sector, you realize so many other things come to bear, as all of our speakers said earlier, on the success of that one area. So for example, in Indonesia and fisheries, you can work on protecting fish and protecting coral reefs, but if you're not looking at where are fishermen getting their income, are there things like health crises that are forcing them to fish more, you're really not going to be successful in the long run. So for a foundation like ours that doesn't have the flexibility of working across sectors, a partnership like this or looking at an integrated approach just really makes a lot of sense, because you're able to leverage not just other funding, but other expertise in order to bring a more concentrated solution to the problems we're trying to solve.
That's great. And forgive me, Nepal is Judy, you're Indonesia. Can you give us a, hello, Michael, welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining us. We said you were going to have a dramatic entrance and then a really hard question. Let me please welcome you, Michael Okorofor.
Thank you.
Michael is the Vice President of Sustainability at McCormick and Company, where he is currently the Vice President of Global Packaging Innovation at McCormick and Company. He's responsible for setting overall global strategy and execution for product innovation across all of the business units. Most interestingly in your bio, of which there are many interesting things, you are an inventor, which is great, and you have over 40 patents, and you're one of the leading thinkers on packaging innovation. You also, as I understand it, have worked for quite some time with USAID on these kinds of projects. So welcome, yes. Michael. Thank you for braving the rain. You have some water right there with you.
Thank you.
And we've just dived into the panel. We had an overview of the HEARTH project, and Heather is just about to talk a little bit about what it looks like in the fishing industry in Indonesia.
Great. Well, so let me just start by saying right now, we're not doing much in the way of complete integration in Indonesia. And the reason I'm here is I'm really interested in pursuing that further. But so I can talk more about the need, at least that I see. So, in Indonesia, which is kind of a middle income country, so you're not looking at conditions like you would in some of the other countries that are HEARTH priorities. You still have communities that are really remote. And when you think about the most pristine places on Earth where there's high biodiversity, beautiful coral reefs, amazing forests, those are also the hardest to reach. And so what I find is those communities that we're working with that are in these beautiful places, they are the ones who have the least access to any kind of services that government is providing, whether it's healthcare, education. In Indonesia, there's a great need for clean water and sanitation, and those are non-existent in coastal areas. And so while we're looking at how do we protect the fish populations, make sure they're there for the future of Indonesians, for their food, for their income, and for them to ship out to us here in the States to eat, we are missing a big piece of the picture because these communities are really not able to think about how can we protect our fish because they're dealing with the constant struggle of just making a living day to day.
Right. Thank you, Heather. Michael, let me go to you if you feel you've settled in enough. We'd love to understand what is McCormick's interest and sort of unique perspective and comparative advantage in advancing sustainable conservation in this way. Would you share a little bit?
Absolutely. First of all, my apologies for the flight delay, but I'm glad I made it. One of the things that we started on a journey we call purpose-led performance. And for those of you who were in Davos with some of us earlier this year, this is the era of purpose. And if you can't be a purpose, yes. And if you can't operate on that realm, you're not going to build trust with the consumers. One thing that is obvious is the millennial mindset, and now the Gen Zs, really led by Greta Thunberg, the Swedish young lady who was a superstar in Davos this January. You can see that this is an era where these young kids are really trying to make a difference. And according to her, if you listen to what is driving them, it is not about us giving them a hope. It is about us doing something to impact their future. And so that comes McCormick. And McCormick, 2 years ago, established what we call purpose-led performance. And what it means is most people think that for-profit companies can't coexist with doing good things. That is absolutely incorrect. So our purpose-led performance is driven by the fact that we're committing to delivering top-tier financial performance while doing the best things for our people, for our communities, and our planet. And what have I just said? It means doing well by doing good. And if you can't do that, you're not going to be around for so long. So if you look at what we've done, look at our stock prices and the type of things we're doing, they are trending upwards. But here's the kicker. The purpose-led performance, we made a deliberate decision to really drive it to where things matter. The farming communities, as my colleague here just said, they are impoverished. And so, as our chairman says, what a better place, what a better person to lead it than somebody that grew up in such a community. I grew up in Nigeria, in an agricultural village. My mom was a subsistence farmer. And I wouldn't be here if not for the fact that I was able to get first-class education before even coming here, and the rest is history. So why can't we do the same thing to those communities? So this is, for me, a purpose of my existence. So to have a major company like McCormick give me the opportunity to live that globally is really a very humbling experience. And here is the thing that we're doing. We're committing to not just improving those communities, we're committing to empowering women ownership in those communities. And we're committing to enabling them by helping them have schools close to their children, like my mom had, which is the reason I'm here, so that they can impact the world, the future generation for good. So that's really why we're doing this. But here is another thing. Public-private partnership, especially our work with USAID, that dates over 30 years ago, has really been dramatic. We contribute one-to-one on some of the things that whether it be the GDP or CDP programs that we work with the USAID. They have been remarkable. And I hope that some people were able to see the video that was made in Madagascar by USAID when I was visiting there. And this really summarizes it. It is not about anything else other than impact. And if you can make an impact, you're not going to be there long for you as a business. So we're delighted to be here.
Beautiful, thank you. And then just as a point of clarification, so the work you're doing is in the communities where you're sourcing spicing products?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think you asked a very interesting question, but let me give, at least for our audience, a nuance. If you look at where we source our herbs and spices, by the way, it doesn't get any better. It's healthy, it's good for you. And growing up, herbs and spices could cure anything from malaria to stomach pains to headaches. I mean, I'm telling you, I grew up in such a community. But here's the thing. The reason that we're invested in those communities, if you look at all the communities where we source our herbs and spices, whether most of them are in the tropics, right? Whether it be Indonesia, whether it be India, whether it be Nigeria, whether it be Madagascar, whether it be areas like Kenya. Most of these places are vulnerable, especially Madagascar and Indonesia. And as our chairman puts it, unless you move the equator, we're going to continue to source from those areas. So it is imperative that we do something to maintain the livelihood of those communities. And that's what we're doing. But not only are we impacting them by enabling them to adopt best practices in farming, guess what? We commit to buying everything they produce at a premium. Okay. So we can prevent them from either going to engage in poaching or damage some preserved areas. Right. That's what the purpose-led performance for McCormick is all about. And we're very proud to say that it's yielding results. And you can look at our financial results. It's doing well. So they can coexist.
Right. That's excellent. Thank you, Michael, for that and for your work. I think we need more Michaels in the world already. Judy, let me move to you and tell us about World Wildlife Fund and the work you're doing there and what your unique perspective is to this question.
So as a conservation organization, we're obviously concerned about the conservation of nature, of species like, the panda on our logo and whales and tigers and so on, but also ecosystems upon which people depend for our well-being and our livelihoods. And, we are very concerned about the decline in biodiversity, as Rob was showing. What can we do to work to reverse those trends while still meeting the needs of people today and in the future? Looking at, population trends, population is still growing, and people's needs around the world, particularly in the developing world. So we, as WWF, we have a presence in over 100 countries around the world. We're able to work from a local level. So working with those local communities who've been stewards of their environment and their natural resources often for centuries, but who are now facing new outside threats, and helping them to withstand those and work in ways where we can help them to develop. And also then working up to global level where we can work with companies to help to promote better practices that are better for the environment and hopefully also for the bottom line of the companies. But coming back to making sure that the communities are thriving. Mm-hmm. And in order to do this, as Heather was mentioning, it's not enough just to bury our heads in a forest or a marine area. We have to look across sectors. We have to look at how our communities, what's their agriculture situation, where are they getting their water from, and everything is so interlinked. Communities see things as a whole. They don't see things in separate sectors. So we have to work with other sectors to make sure that communities' needs can be met. And that people's ecosystems can continue to provide the services that we all depend on.
So Judy, let me ask you to take it from the theoretical to the more practical. So we just saw a presentation from Rob that talked about projects in HEARTH are going to need to monitor effects in health, in productivity, in governance, there may be one more, environment. So the one you worked on for so long in Nepal, would it have had all of those elements?
We did. We were really fortunate in this project in Nepal in that it was funded by the USAID mission, who were very open to us working across sectors, doing a very multidisciplinary approach. And particularly in our work on building people's resilience to climate change, we worked on so many different things. Depending on what people's climate risks were, we could work on water supplies. If irregular rainfall was drying up water supplies, we could work on improving agriculture, making agriculture more resilient to climate change, maybe new crops or greenhouses to grow crops out of season. Because Nepal is such a mountainous country, very often more intense rainfall that comes with climate change was resulting in more landslides and more floods. So we were working on soil bioengineering to try and stabilize hillsides. We were helping people to find solutions to floods, reforesting areas to reduce these risks. So we were able to work across very, very many sectors, working also on health, so helping people to get better access to health, helping women to get better access to family planning so that they could space their children and be more resilient to climate. Just depending on how people were vulnerable, we could bring in these multidisciplinary approaches.
Great, thank you. That's unusual. Olaf, let's turn to you from the USAID perspective. You have the opportunity to represent the whole USAID right now in front of your colleagues. So tell us,
don't put that on my shoulders.
Tell us how USAID is uniquely positioned and what's your comparative advantage in approaching this question?
Yeah, so thanks again for hosting us. This is a really great opportunity. The HEARTH program, I think, embodies some of the ideals that we're working towards. So, I help lead the Forestry and Biodiversity Office. So obviously we're focused on conservation of biodiversity. And I think we go at it for two reasons. So one, because biodiversity is important in its own right, but also two, because we see, as Judy was mentioning, the goods and services that biodiversity and healthy ecosystems provide for human communities, for development. And for us as a biodiversity unit sitting within a development agency, I think we really have the opportunity to make some of those connections. In our biodiversity policy, we specifically called out the need to integrate better with other development sectors inside of USAID. And that's because not only we feel like we can demonstrate, or we want to demonstrate, the value that biodiversity brings for development, but also because a lot of the challenges that we face in biodiversity are coming from other development challenges, things like poverty, things like food insecurity, things like conflict and governance. So much of the work that we do to protect ecosystems and natural resources, for example, it depends on governance. It's absolutely critical. It's working with communities to figure out a way to manage a resource that's vital for their livelihoods. And so we feel like we had a lot to learn from our other sector colleagues, and so we've really tried to be intentional about working with them, learning from their tools and approaches, and trying to demonstrate sort of the relationship between the environment and development.
Right. So thank you, that's very helpful. So let me push back a little bit. I think if this were as easy to do as you all are describing, we would all be doing it. Yes. And so I'm gonna speak just really from a little personal experience. My husband's an environmentalist, and I work on poverty issues and health issues. And we put it in our marriage vows that we would promise to care about, I would promise to care about the trees, and he promised to care about the people. But we bring we're not doing very well, remember, for 20 years. We bring very different perspectives. He feels like things that I do on people or health are in service of the environment. And I often feel that he does not taking the time to recognize the complexities of what it takes for a household to survive, for example. And we are talking in a room here of people coming from different sectors. So let's talk about the barriers here and how we address these, because our colleagues at HEARTH, who are very innovative here, are trying to put something really different out. But we know how hard it is to do this. So Michael, let me turn to you. Tell me a little bit about how we can make sure that each of those 4 areas are of equal weight in these efforts, and for those that are thinking about applying for this.
Absolutely. I want to build on the comment you made that these things are not easy. So if you recognize that, then you will also recognize that you cannot do it on your own. In fact, I would say, even at McCormick, we don't have all the expertise to execute what we like to do. It's one thing to have goodwill, but it doesn't count if you can't bring action to support that goodwill. So here's what we're doing. WWF is our partner, and been our partner for quite some time. So when it comes to things like the biodiversity and all those things, we're working with WWF in Papua, Indonesia, a project co-funded by USAID that will please you. And what are we doing? We're helping. There are some natural reserve, and these are UNESCO natural reserve areas in Papua, Indonesia. So we're preventing the farmers from going into there beyond the buffer areas to poach or to cut lumber. That's one piece. So working with WWF gets that one done. Now, let me play you and your husband here. So if you look at,
We need help.
I know that. We do too. If you look at what we're doing on the human side, we are a partner with CARE. You know, CARE International, most of you know CARE, and NCBA CLUSA. Why have we partnered with CARE? When it comes to livelihood issues, and we're committed by 2025 to impact over 35,000 farmers in areas where we source on livelihood issues. What do I mean by that? Helping them to really improve in their resources, helping them to send their kids to school, helping them to practice good things. CARE is an expert when it comes to the human aspect, so we leverage them. NCBA CLUSA is an expert when it comes to creating cooperatives. I don't know if most of you know, it's one of the leading cooperative creating NGO in the world, ahead of any other ones. So we're partners with those. So one of the things I tell people is, it's not because we're experts, but we know who to get to help us. And I do believe this, and this is something you can take away. I do believe that the NGOs are the moral compass of what we're trying to do in the area of sustainability, biodiversity, women empowerment, health improvement, and that's where we're engaging them. One situation in Madagascar, part of that video you saw earlier, was the partnership with NCBA CLUSA and USAID for the Southern African zone. I love them. But the point is this. We were there helping the farmers with free, interest-free loans. We pay the interest because in the lean season, these farmers can't afford to feed their families because think about it, they make one income a year in the harvest season. So when the lean season comes, and I know this, growing up in a farm community, it's very difficult to really make ends meet. So we provide interest-free loans. So when they sell their crops, they can repay those interests. And one thing I have to give USAID credit is that they are really supporting some of those activities. And so what are we doing? We're also making sure we bring in Rainforest Alliance to teach them not just good agricultural practices, but good agricultural practices coupled with biodiversity at the farm level. So that's another NGO that we're working with. So that's how we're addressing this thing. It can be done, but you have to recognize the limitations that you have and then reach out and leverage your way into prosperity.
Beautiful.
That's how I think about it.
Thank you. I think you've been waiting for this project for a long time.
Absolutely.
Now you're going to be our ambassador.
Yeah.
Everyone be thinking about your questions. We'll have some mics, but I want to, Judy, can you speak to this question of sort of how do we give equal weight to these different dimensions of this project from your own perspective? And the barriers.
Yeah, and the challenges. Yeah. So I think it's really important when you're forming any kind of partnership is you have to really understand the people that you want to partner with, and you have to find some shared objectives. As we partner with development partners, we're never going to have exactly the same objectives, but somewhere there's a sweet spot where we sort of overlap. Similarly with private sector, you're interested in making a profit, but you're also interested in doing good, which is fantastic. So we're interested in biodiversity. We're also interested, both of us, in the communities doing well. So finding those sweet spots where we have some common objectives, even although our missions may be very different. And then understanding each other, developing trust, and it takes time. There is a transaction cost. And you have to work out, is this going to be worthwhile? Is this the right partner for this kind of situation? And the more partners that you bring in, of course, the more complicated it can get as well. So I think being really clear about the goals up front, we had to do this in the Nepal project, and we continued having these discussions amongst our consortium partners. We partnered with CARE, and then we also partnered with two national NGOs. One was a forest federation of community forest user groups, and the other one was a conservation NGO. So bringing these four partners together around a table, some of them for the first time, was a challenge. But the benefits were so great because we achieved so much more than we could ever have achieved individually. But you do have to work out You know, what's the transaction cost going to be? Is it worth it? You know, are the results in the end going to be? For us, they definitely were. I mean, you know, we reached so many people, and we were able to improve forest management, improve livelihoods, reduce disaster, and so on and so forth. But
Good.
yeah,
Thank you.
it has to be worthwhile.
Thank you. Heather, would you like to jump in on this question of challenges and?
Yeah, I do. I want to add to what Michael and Judy said. I think one of the big challenges I've seen is that the certain sectors, like the environment sector, you work at a different scale than other sectors like governance and health. So for example, when you're talking about biodiversity, you're looking at a forest area, landscape, specific communities, where the health sector is looking at a system, a health system, and looking at how do we affect a whole system and change it at scale. So I think the secret to good integration is like the secret to a good marriage, to come back to your marriage, which is figuring out compromise. You're not going to be able to meet all the objectives of both sectors. And so I've often found some of the sectors have to compromise around the biodiversity goals, to be honest, because if you're working in these remote, far communities, you're not reaching a whole lot of people, which could be a game changer for some sectors like the health sector, which says, well, how do we scale this? How do we take this to scale? How do we reach the most people? And I think sometimes you're not going to do that, and you have to be okay with it and just say, we're okay with having great impact in this very special place. And then maybe taking these examples and scaling them to other very special places.
That's so helpful. I'm glad you raised that issue of the landscape, because that is one of the frames in the HEARTH project, that it needs to work at that level, certainly for biodiversity. Olaf, tell us your perspective on this question of challenges. You don't have to comment on my marriage anymore. We've covered that. But challenges.
Yeah, perhaps I better refrain from that. Yeah, I'll jump in on the scale question specifically. I think the kind of spatial scale, the landscape scale is really important. I think also the time scale is an issue when we talk about integration. I mean, when we're talking about biodiversity, conservation, you know, we're taking a longer view. Many other sectors are able to measure a benefit, you know, a health intervention leading to lives saved over a shorter term. And many times it's harder to demonstrate the value of conserving a forest in the very near term, because, you know, people depend on that forest, and in the short term they're able to use, you know, access those resources and be able to support their livelihoods. But if you step back and think about what's the long-term prognosis for those communities or for the countries in which we're working in, that, you know, to need those resources to be there for a longer-term development trajectory, I think it's a different, sometimes can be a mismatch. I will also jump in on the kind of challenges in the private sector. I think in conservation, we have a long history of working in conservation enterprises. So we'll work with communities around a specific product, a forest product, or fisheries or timber or something like that. And, you know, those can be very successful and provide a lot of income and motivation for some communities, but sometimes they fail. And sometimes they fail and they're not sustained over the long term. When the donor funding ends, the enterprise fails, and people go back to business as usual. And so this is where I think, you know, our challenge is that maybe we haven't brought in the private sector early enough in some of our endeavors in the past in conservation. So I think the opportunity of bringing everyone together at the beginning is really a bit of I mean, it's a great opportunity to build on some of those kind of failures in the past and learn from them, and really figure out how do you make something sustainable over the long term. You know, we're not, as conservationists or perhaps as development officials, we're not going to be able to look at markets the same way that the private sector will. We're not going to be able to bring the same expertise and training possibilities or investment opportunities that the private sector will. So I think it's a really good opportunity.
That's great. I want to go to questions, and we'll turn to you first. I do just simply want to say, is there anything about the USAID process which is going to be limiting for the complexity and the dynamism? That wasn't a loaded question at all. Is there any...
Hope you're not asking me.
Well, I am asking you, because you're the USAID representative. Any thoughts about that as it relates to going into this highly important innovative work?
Yeah, so I think my other panelists can probably comment on some of the challenges of working with USAID. I do think there probably are some. I mean, obviously, our time frame and our processes move at a different pace than perhaps the private sector does, or even NGOs who are able to be more agile. We are kind of governed by our funding cycles and by the different requirements that we need to meet in order to move money, and also to demonstrate our impact, the indicators, the evaluation processes that we use. So, there is a learning curve. I think the nice thing about HEARTH is bringing everybody together at the very beginning maybe can help kind of put all those issues out on the table, making that space for discussion, as Judy and others were mentioning, being able to address those mismatches potentially in objectives or in metrics up front, I think will be really helpful.
And there's a piece that seems to imply that HEARTH is going to approach M&E in an interesting way and develop new sets of indicators, which is great.
Yeah, that's really great. I
Which
think
you
we're
could
really looking for those opportunities
impact,
that
yeah.
demonstrate that impact.
Good. Let's open it up for questions. Please, there'll be a microphone. Sabra has the first one. Would you just say your name and your organization and keep your question brief so we can also do that? And who has the live stream questions, if there is anyone? Excellent. So I'll turn to you next after this first question, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a comment.
Would you mind standing up? Thank you.
A comment and a question. The comment is congratulating Firuz Ruyani. I'm with Tetra Tech, which is a major contractor to USAID, based in Arlington here. At first, I wanted to congratulate USAID, Jeff, and the team that finally they overcame the whole issue of integrating.
Maybe you just speak into the phone so the people on the screen can hear.
PPP and monitoring evaluation and sustainability across a number of vital sectors like water, environment, etc. So congratulations, and wish you best. And if we can be of any support, we'll provide the support. Now my question is the last speaker mentioned about Kafue Flat in Zambia as one of the first, pilot projects. I happened to be there, study flat, 1992, on behalf of World Bank. And I'm a geologist by training. I found that flat, I spent lots of time in there. At that time, there was very limited population, few villages, and all stricken by AIDS at that time. And I didn't see any chance for any private sector to advise World Bank to investigate it further. Because physically, that flat is a disaster. Climate-wise, dry season, wet season, geology, soil, and just the lack of access at that time. So I wonder maybe things have changed.
Right.
I would like to know, and
Appreciate
if you want to discuss it, I'm available to share my observations from the flat. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take a couple of questions, but that's a very helpful one, especially because you've picked tough places. You've picked tough places. Okay. Please, the woman in the back, would you stand up? Right there, yes. Here comes the mic.
My name is Smita. I'm with Population Reference Bureau with our People Health and Planet program. And I'm wondering, people have referenced population health and environment projects. And a lot of those, the successful projects have incorporated community-led policy efforts. And so I'm wondering if anyone can speak a little bit about the role that policy will play in HEARTH's work or mandate.
Great question. Let's take one more question. This woman right here, and then we'll turn to the panel, please.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Park from RTI International. I wanted to follow up on the last point about the indicators and ask if USAID had any initial indicators that they might be thinking about for the HEARTH program that might be a bit more appropriate, again, when we're exploring new models and trying to co-create with the private sector. Things like number of hectares or number of people trained might not be the most appropriate. So I just wanted to see what the thinking was around the design of indicators and metrics for the HEARTH program.
Great, excellent. Let's turn to the first one. So we have three questions: Zambia and the challenge of what's happening in that particular water system. The question of policy, is it a piece? And the other question of indicators. And does anyone, Michael, do you want to jump in on any of those questions?
Sure. By the way, we work with Tetra Tech. In fact, we have a project right now in the Mikaji region of Madagascar with Tetra Tech that USAID is a sponsor, so you know that. So exactly. But here's the thing: when you look at those protected areas, I think you have to change our approach. The idea of thinking that we focus mostly on arable land that can be cultivated without considering what is happening in the community is not right. So the example I have is some of the protected areas. Actually, in Indonesia, there are about 22,500 hectares of preserved land. But outside of those preserved land is a buffer region where people can farm. But what is happening is when you plant those things, you don't make enough money. So they resort to poaching. They resort to cotton, timber, and those kind of things. But here's what we've done with USAID. And we have encouraged those farmers to start, this is in Indonesia, to start planting vanilla. Most of you know that natural vanilla is good stuff, but it's expensive. It's like gold, right? So when they plant those, we commit to complete uptake at a premium. Guess what? If you're going to spend time planting vanilla, and you are reassured that you're going to sell it to a major company that will take it, pay you a premium, that's worth it on a consistent basis than going to gamble on poaching, okay? Which WWF is going to be there screaming, and they're our partner. And so most of them are resorting to now planting vanilla. And talk about biodiversity and landscape. Do you realize that vanilla is a great crop when it comes to preserving the soil? So one of the things that people don't realize is that when it comes to practicing good soil management, vanilla is a good one because you don't need to till the soil to plant vanilla. Vanilla is an orchid. You just stick it in the soil, it grows. And that's what is important. And these people are benefiting from it. So what am I saying so far is that hope is not enough in this thing. So I tell people that hope is not a strategy. And we cannot wait for USAID process to complete before we start it. It's for the betterment of our business. So once we get there, what I found out is if we go into it with a good strategy, and remember we're there for profit, USAID comes and amplifies it even more. So for us, it's a win, win, win. And I don't see any way we can lose. And you can look at our stock price, it's showing that. So that's all I can say. I have evidence to prove it works.
That's great.
So does that help you with some of your questions and concerns?
No, your response is very valid.
Yeah, that particular flat. Let me turn to you, Olaf, to respond to the question of does policy fit and also the indicators question.
Yeah. Sure. I think policy definitely fits. I think everywhere that we work, if we're working on conservation, if we're working on health, if we're working on food security, policy is a big aspect of that kind of enabling environment. I'll say that private sector engagement I think is a really powerful tool and really important for providing economic alternatives, but I don't think it's going to succeed in a vacuum. It needs to have an enabling policy environment around it. If it's a resource that's threatened by poaching or threatened by incursion, there needs to be some kind of a policy environment. There needs to be a way to enforce the community rules about who gets to access resources. Without that, the private sector initiative will fail. So absolutely, and I think that's where USAID brings some value to these partnerships because we can help work on that enabling environment. We can look at some of the policy issues. Maybe we already have programs that are working on that. We certainly have networks of partners and local government and national government counterparts. We can try to take some of that risk off of the private sector investment.
Thank you.
To make it more successful.
Right. And do you want to respond to the indicators, or does someone else from the team want to respond to that? Please. Go ahead.
I wanted to add something real quick, and I'm glad that you raised the PHE work because I do think that the population health environment work that USAID funded is actually a great learning for HEARTH, and both on policy and monitoring and evaluation. There is a lot out there already on how to do integrated work for those two areas. And on policy, I think that I talked about the challenge of scale. And I think actually policy is the way to get to that challenge because you can scale up this integrated work through policy. And the example I think that you gave in Indonesia is a great one. I'm very familiar with your project.
Thank you.
And the interesting thing there is that through this project, you can convince the Indonesian government that in Papua, there is a pathway to growth that is not deforestation-based, right? And that people's lives and livelihoods can be improved. On the M&E front, the one thing I wanted to raise is that I think the beauty of the HEARTH mechanism is not just on integrating indicators, but results. Looking at how do we actually show impact that integration has better results than doing things in a single sector fashion.
Excellent, great, really helpful. Other questions? Please. Here, Sabbath, bring in.
Hi, I'm Audrey Donahue from Tetra Tech as well. My question is about infrastructure. You know, where does that fall in this conversation? And we've had a gap here about, there's access to different services, but what role can we play from a very physical development standpoint?
That's a great question. Other questions? Can we take a couple of them? Are there any? Yes, please, from online live stream. I think it might be on. Try it.
I turned it on. Yes, we have a question. What if we have a project idea for a country not listed in the notice, but USAID does work in the country? Can we submit a concept paper?
Okay, great, excellent question. One more question? Please, the gentleman right there.
Hi, I'm Chris Seek with Solimar International. We're a sustainable tourism consulting company. The question is really related to the private sector partnerships, and I guess this maybe for Olaf is there a preference for global private companies, like the global brands, like a McCormick, like in our space, it's Google, it's Airbnb, Expedia, or is it preferred to have the local private sector that tends to have more ability to move the needle in terms of the destinations and things that they work in? And then also this question of one-to-one match always comes up with smaller companies. They tend to be able to bring access to market, access to know-how. They're willing to sell that community enterprise, but they're not willing to write a check. And so just a curiosity there of whether or not there's a value in those type of partnerships as well.
Great question, great. Okay, anybody want to jump in on any of those three? Infrastructure, other countries that are not listed on the 6 right now, in the private sector
I'll
role?
take the infrastructure issue. That's a great observation. In some of the areas where we operate, the infrastructure is very challenging. What is happening is obviously the government doesn't have the financial resources to really put the right infrastructure in some of those remote areas. For instance, when I was in the Sava region in Madagascar, for instance, it's very treacherous how to get there. But what we're thinking is that when you demonstrate to the government that the community itself can thrive in spite of the lack of infrastructure, it becomes a priority for them. And that is where I think in the case of USAID and HEARTH will really help address some of those, is we're not where we need to be. That is the type of thing that is happening, okay? So I would tell you that that's, I think HEARTH should know that because it also impacts the terrain. So that's an area of investment that we'll have to do. It's a future.
Do you want to come in on infrastructure or a different point?
Infrastructure. I think you're absolutely right that people deserve access, access to markets, access to health services and education and everything. But at the same time, in many parts of the world, we're seeing a lot of infrastructure at the moment that is going in very quickly. The China Belt and Road, for example, that isn't. But also at local level, we saw this in Nepal as well, a lot of local roads that are going in without being adequately planned, designed and planned, doing huge amounts of damage to local communities who are losing land, losing water supplies, losing their forests because roads are just going in, zigzagging up hillsides, causing landslides and so on. And then we're seeing this on a bigger scale as well, roads going into areas that have been wilderness and providing access for illegal logging and hunting and all the rest of it. So yes, the world needs infrastructure, but well planned and in a good way with the appropriate government regulation. And then also empowering local communities to make sure that they can continue to look after their resources as this infrastructure goes in. So it's kind of a complicated thing. And I would say from a WWF point of view, we're not against infrastructure per se, but we really want it to be well developed.
You are you're showing us the beginnings of the tensions between these worlds coming together. Olaf, I think we need you to answer the question of other countries and also the one-to-one match.
Sure. And for any really specific questions or follow-up questions, I'll direct you to the HEARTH team that's sitting here. They've all got those nice bright yellow name tags. To answer the question on the countries, I think in this first round, this call for proposals, we are focused on those 6 countries. They're, those USAID missions overseas have identified funding and have identified an interest to receive concepts. I think Rob mentioned we are open to receiving other ideas from other countries or other priorities, but just understanding that there's not necessarily identified funding or an identified opportunity yet. That doesn't mean that we aren't interested in good ideas. I think Rob put it well. There's nothing like a good idea to come in that might help stimulate some thinking on the part of our counterparts overseas. So I think we'd welcome any idea that would be.
Great.
Yeah, if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, and if I could just, I don't know if this is working.
There you go. Take it.
Yes. Send us those ideas at hearthgda@usa.gov, and we're happy to have lots of conversations. The next few months will be lots of conversations on the one-to-one match question. That's why I got up. It's important. So we welcome all private sector. We love local in-country. Yes, they might have a harder time with the one-to-one match. The rules of the one-to-one match are explicitly laid out in the solicitation. It's typically around 25% cash, and the rest is in kind, or there's other things that can count to that. It can also be several private sector partners that come together to create that one-to-one match. So we absolutely want the local private sector. If they can't get to it on their own, perhaps a global company can come in and do well by doing good.
Thank you.
Thank you for that,
And
Rob.
I would say that developing local private sector entrepreneurs, local companies, I think is very much the vision of our private sector engagement policy and our long-term goals for development. We want to encourage the private sector in the countries where we work.
Great. So join me in thanking this remarkable group of panelists who have done such a great job and are really on the front lines of this work and have had a lot of experience. And I want to turn it over for closing remarks. And I'd also like to say we have coffee. The coffee now we know is from Madagascar. It's quite delicious over there, and time for networking with others. But over to you, please.
Great, thank you. Is this on?
Take that.
Wonderful, yes. Peggy, thank you. Aspen Institute, thank you for hosting, and certainly all of our panelists. It has been a really interesting, different perspectives that they've been able to share. And that's what really HEARTH is about, is trying to bring together all of these different perspectives. And we are so thrilled to see such a fantastic turnout and so much interest within USAID. Thank you for our office support and more broadly. And we are convinced and enthusiastic that we will create transformative solutions. Because look at this group. Together, we can come up with the solutions. We can get over the challenges, which can be difficult. Within the HEARTH team itself in USAID, we've had a year and a half of ups and downs trying to bring all these sectors together, but we succeeded. We have the expertise. We've kind of ironed out all of those issues that Olaf mentioned, so we are ready to help you. And as I really liked, Judy, what you said, we're going to find that sweet spot. Right. We're going to work together. We're going to form transformative solutions and do good for the planet and the people.
Great.
So thank you very much.
Let me also just give
I will
a
just
small
say-
shout out to the innovators team that put this together. Sabra, are you in the room? Yes. Sabra, thank you so much for everything that you did. And to the HEARTH team, and we welcome you all for the next conversation on this project.
And I will just say, for those people who are in the room, we are here. The HEARTH team is here to stay around and answer any questions. As Olaf mentioned, we do have bright neon duct tape name tags. So we are here to help. Thank you.
Thank you. Great job, guys. Thanks. That was really good.